So first of all, let me introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rebecca Gilpin. I'm one of the officials with the Ulster Teachers Union. I'm joined here by my colleague from the INTO, Kevin Daly, and by Danielle Black from the NEU. So these are a series of joint webinars, which are really just, I suppose, we're going through most of the T&C procedures and a couple of other topics and subjects that we think are really relevant to you all. And the purpose of this is that we're going to go through them and provide you with the content and the relevant information. Some of these documents tend to be very difficult to read and digest if it's not your bread and butter to do every day. It tends to be ours, so we deal with those a lot, and you as teachers maybe don't. So I'm going to give you a presentation on today's topic, which is the salary policy. And then we're going to have question and answers towards the end as well. Okay, let me share my screen here. So hopefully you'll be able to see this. Okay. On presentation mode here. Okay, so today's topic is all about the salary policy, and we thought it's particularly relevant to talk about the salary policy because it's something that is so important, but a lot of our members are not aware that A, it exists, and B, that they're actually entitled to be consulted on the salary policy, and that it's a document that is extremely important to how the school functions and the management structure. So we always think it's good that our members know and our reps know that this is out there and that they have the right to request this. And I'm going to talk about more of the contents now. So the aims of this webinar that you can gain an overview of this guidance. It's quite a lengthy document with a lot of appendices, which I'm not going to go through all of them, but the key points. And that you understand the implications on recruitment and allowances that are within this policy, and that you also know your rights and entitlements. So this is the name of the actual document that I'm referring to. It's called the Guidance on Boards of Governors on the Formulation and Implementation of Salary Policy. So it's a lengthy title already, and it's from the year 2008. So there is a DE circular from 1993/24, and that requires all schools to develop such a policy and also keep it. Now, and that should be done in consultation with you, the teaching staff, and it should include an agreed management structure. And what that means, I'm going to show you in a minute. The salary policy can reflect the current structure of staffing, but it can also be an aspirational target. So, for example, if it's something that the school might develop to in a few years' time, or certain positions within that salary policy might not be staffed yet. So the key points of the salary policy guidance: the salary policies should set out the principles to guide all the pay decisions and the procedures followed. And it should, oh, this doesn't let me click here, hold on. There should be a timetable for annual salary reviews. Now, this is sort of, it goes without saying that there is obviously an annual PRSD process for our members, so that's the salary reviews, but for vice principals and principals it can be slightly different, so we're going to talk about that as well. It should all operate under the key notes and the key points of objectivity, openness and accountability, and that's your first right. Within that, it should be available to all teaching staff, and that includes temporary and permanent. We are aware of a couple of schools who don't make that available. Some haven't touched their salary policy in years, and others are saying that you can only request it if you're the teacher rep or the union rep, or if you're permanent members of staff. None of that is correct. So let's start with the first section of the salary policy. This is all about leadership groups. So this is in relation to how is the leadership group and the salaries associated with that determined. So the leadership group is a 43-point pay spine, which you might have seen, and it's if you go on any union's website or on the department website as well, it gives you an overview of your teacher salary and the different points on that, but also the leadership policy and then the pay scale. So this is banded into 8 school principals groups, and those are determined by the size of the school. So the IRs are the individual school range. There's a circular from 2006 that goes into more detail, which we're not going to do at this point. But to give you an overview of what that looks like, that is the current leadership scale and the principal bands. And then so you have 8 groups, and then you can see the leadership points, L6 to L18, for example, would be the group 1. So that is how the principal pay would work and is structured. Now, it's the governor's responsibility to set out a 7-point individual school range within the range of points available within the school principals groups. So if you have a look here, you've got L6 to L18 and L8 to L21. So it's again for the individual board of governors to determine what their principal, where I suppose the salary of the principal should operate within, and that there's guidance towards that as well. It's assumed and it's expected that a new principal appointed to a school would start on the base point, but can be put on the maximum 0.3 of that relevant 7-point ISR. For vice principals, accordingly, there's a 5-point pay range, and they must start on a point above the pay of the highest classroom teacher. Now, this is really important because we have had cases where the vice principal only got paid, let's say, £50 more than the highest paid classroom teacher. There needs to be a very clear differential, and sometimes that can be missed if not all aspects of this salary policy are considered. Because if you imagine somebody could be on a TA5 and on UPS 3, if somebody starts very low on the leadership scale, there might not be a gap or not a high enough gap. So that definitely needs to be considered. And it must not overlap with the IRSR. So again, there needs to be a clear difference between the vice principal's pay and the principal's pay. And like with the principal's pay, a newly appointed vice principal normally starts at the base point of that 5-point pay range, but can be put on a maximum of 0.2. Why is that built in there? Again, there's flexibility in there because it depends obviously of the background and the pay that a newly appointed principal or vice principal comes from. So there is discretion when it comes to the placement of the scale of those newly appointed principals and vice principal. So now, as for pay progression for those on the leadership scale, there is no automatic pay progression like we would have with our classroom teachers. It's based on the annual review of performance. Normally, if there is no issue with performance, and as long as it's within the pay range that's determined by the Board of Governors, normally there is no issue with principals and vice principals going up the pay scale every year. Now, there can also be a maximum of 2 points awarded per year. That can happen, for example, if there's particular achievement, if the context of the school has changed, if the profile of pupils or the profile of staff to manage has changed. So that can be considered, and that's for the Board of Governors' discretion, and usually they would get advice from the relevant authority as well. For teachers, as I'm sure you're all aware, there is the annual PRSD process. So you have automatic annual pay progression from M2 to M6, and from UPS 1, that's then in steps of 2 years. So you would stay 2 years on UPS 1 to go up to UPS 2, and then another 2 years from UPS 2 to UPS 3. To go from M6 to UPS 3, you have to apply for thresholds. So again, that's something that really there's an expectation on the school, on the principal, to remind teaching staff that it's the PRSD process, that is the annual pay review, and those who are going through thresholds have to apply for that. The onus is on the teacher to apply for that. Some teachers choose not to apply for that. I suppose some might have relevant reasons. Sometimes they potentially forget, but really the onus should be on the principal to remind all staff that are eligible to do so. There is a little bit more paperwork involved in the threshold, and then it should be automatic pay progression thereafter, subject obviously to satisfactory PRSD. And as I say in point 3 there, pay progression may be, and that's really very rare, it may be impacted by disciplinary sanctions or unsatisfactory teaching. But there's a lot that would have to go on before it comes to something like that. Something that I thought was really important to mention here as well for those of you or colleagues of you that you're aware of who are teaching on NISTER. We often get phone calls from teachers on NISTER who are not sure whether they are eligible to actually progress on the pay scale. So the guidance is quite clear that you don't have to work full time and you don't have to work continuously for the entire year to be able to go up the pay scale. The guidance makes it clear that it's based on an aggregate of at least 26 weeks of teaching in the year. So that means you can have a bit of teaching in the beginning of the year and a bit of teaching at the end of the year. It's an aggregate. It doesn't have to be continuous service. So as long as that is provided, there shouldn't be a problem going up the pay scale. It might be worthwhile for those teachers on NISA to have these conversations with the schools that they're teaching, or if it's one particular school, it should be fairly straightforward. There are also discretionary pay awards. And that's becoming more and more common as we have teachers, especially our recently or newly qualified teachers, who might start their teaching career outside of Northern Ireland. So the recommendation would be that every teacher who started teaching either within the United Kingdom or the Republic of Ireland, that they would get 1 point per year worked in those various jurisdictions. There is discretion in relation to other countries, and that's particularly important for those who maybe seek work in the Emirates somewhere, for example. So it isn't always as straightforward, and sometimes there has to be consultation with GDC and I as well. Non-teaching experience, and I had a query about that not that long ago, can of course be counted as well. It has to be relevant non-teaching experience, and one typical scenario would be if a member had worked in higher education. So that is obviously very relevant teaching experience. We often get asked the questions from PGCE students who maybe are career changers who've worked in, let's say, engineering, for example, and then do a PGCE in science, whether they could start on a higher salary. Theory is absolutely yes, they can. That can happen. Does it happen very often in Northern Ireland? No. But I suppose if there's a shortage in specialist teachers, there is more mileage and potentially requesting that. So then we come to teaching allowances. So the nature of a teaching allowance by definition would be that what you're doing as part of your teaching allowance is something that is not required of all classroom teachers. So there has to be a very clear distinction. It has to focus primarily on teaching and learning. And quite often you would be required to lead, manage, and develop a subject or curriculum area and have an impact on the educational progress of pupils. This is clearly spelled out because it didn't used to be the case. There would be teaching allowances. There would have been teaching allowances, for example, to manage a PE store and other things, where you wouldn't get teaching allowance for these days anymore. Now, once you have a teaching allowance, it can't be taken off you. That's really important as well. If you have applied for a teaching allowance and you've been awarded a teaching allowance, nobody can take it off you. There can be renegotiation if the areas of responsibility due to the nature and the needs of the school are changing, but that has to be in consultation with you. There are teaching allowances from 1 to 5, and only one of them can be awarded. And again, that is something that maybe not so much anymore, but used to be quite widespread, that teachers would tell us that they have 2 TA1s or 2 TA2s. That's not possible. So if you have one teaching allowance, you start on a TA1 and then you would go higher up. It's not possible to have more than one. It should normally be permanent, and the guidance is very clear, and the employing authorities are very clear in their explanations of that as well. They need to be and have to be permanent unless you're covering obviously a prolonged absence for a colleague, or there are fixed term projects. Now, these fixed term projects shouldn't be confused with, oh, we're not entirely sure whether we need a PE coordinator next year. That's not a good enough reason. So it tends to be things that are funded from the outside. So shared education, for example, would be a prime example. Shared educations were always by default a kind of fixed term project because the funding doesn't directly come out of the school budget. And therefore there would be temporary allocations of teaching allowances. Anything else we would challenge. So the use of 5 teaching allowances should reflect the size and the responsibility structure of the school. Quite often we have to explain to teachers that there is, of course, a great variety of teaching allowances that are between the schools, and there is a perceived and quite rightly perceived sometimes an unfairness to it, that you could be in a smallish school and you are the literacy coordinator and the numeracy coordinator, and you maybe don't get a teaching allowance for that at all, a paid one, or you get one, and your colleague across the road in a bigger school is only the literacy coordinator is on a TA2, for example. So again, this is all based on the needs of the school and the budget that's available for the school, and how the governors decide to award those teaching allowances and what they award them for. It should be expected that teachers with similar levels of responsibility should have the same teaching allowances, and that's taking into account legislation of equal pay and other employment as well. So if you are a head of English and you're on a TA3 and your colleague is head of math and you have a similar amount of staff to manage and similar lessons to teach within the department, there would be an expectation that you're both on the same pay, unless there's obviously other responsibilities within that particular teaching allowance. Something that is also really important to note, that teaching allowance can of course be awarded for part-time teachers, and this is particularly relevant for those members of staff who are seeking flexible working. So if you or a colleague would like to reduce their hours, let's say from a 5-day working week to a 3-day working week for a variety of reasons, could be childcare, should be caring responsibilities, could be anything, which you're entitled to request, of course, under legislation. That doesn't automatically mean you have to give up your teaching allowances. And it also doesn't have to mean that you're only being paid 3/5 of your teaching allowances. So that is something that needs to be talked about and that needs to be discussed when that request for flexible working or part-time working goes through. So it's not allowed, schools are literally not allowed to just pay 3/5 of an allowance and the 2/5 they do nothing with. So what can obviously happen, that let's say you are the literacy coordinator, you are getting paid 3/5 of the allowance, you are doing the job for 3 days a week, and your colleague does 2/5 of the job and then gets the remainder, the 2/5 of the teaching allowance. That's absolutely fine if that's negotiated. All too often we find that people do the entire job, which for the likes of literacy you can possibly do within 3 or 4 days per week, but that they're only getting paid 3/5 or 4/5 of the teaching allowance. That's not right, and that shouldn't be happening, and it can be challenged. And we would also consider then putting in a request for back pay if you've been doing the entirety of the job. So it's a discussion that should be taking place upon request of a flexible working arrangement or a part-time working. Then the next set of allowance are obviously SEN allowance. So there is an SEN1 and there is an SEN2, and there is guidance in the salary policy. I'm just making you aware here that there is at the moment a draft, I suppose an upgrade of that guidance that is still in consultation between the teaching units, the NITC, and the employers, because they're looking to review these, I suppose, directions and this guidance with regard to SEN allowance. But this is what schools are currently operating under, and we would very much say that this is what governors should look at, and this is what we would point our members to as well. So an SEN1, teacher in a special school would get an SEN1, or if you're a teacher in a mainstream school, the definition says if you're wholly or mainly teaching pupils with statements of special educational needs, and the statements don't have to be there for pupils who are visually or hearing impaired, or if you're in SEN classes in mainstream, and again, that is something that's very relevant now that we're having more and more pupils with SEN in mainstream as well. In addition to that, the governors can award a discretionary SEN to other teachers who also contribute to the teaching of SEN in the school. Again, depending on the situation that a school might find itself in, it might be worthwhile to consider awarding more than just one SEN allowance to one particular teacher, especially if there's a big proportion of pupils who have statements or special educational needs. And SEN2 should be awarded to those teachers where it can be shown that the teacher's experience and or qualification enhance the value of the work, and that he or she undertakes with special educational needs pupils. And this per se at the moment applies to all special schools and should also apply to SPIM classrooms, for example. But again, all of this is discretionary to the Board of Governors and should be assessed on a case-to-case basis. This is an example of the management structure. So it's what I suppose what you would see in private business quite often. It's also something that is available to all schools, that every school should have. It's just not always something that I suppose teaching staff are aware of, that they actually can get a copy of. So there's a principal, quite often there's a vice principal, sometimes there isn't. Now this, I suppose, this example that I've drawn up is from a post-primary school, from a fairly large post-primary school. So let's assume there's a principal, there's a vice principal, and then you have a senior teacher who's in charge of the curriculum, who is in receipt of the TA4, and you've got another senior teacher who is in charge of the pastoral side of things, also on a TA4. Then you would have 6 head of departments, and the teaching allowances should depend or can depend on the number of periods taught. That's the criteria for that particular salary policy. And you have 7 heads of years, and they are all on a TA1. Then you would have other areas of responsibilities that are all attracting a TA1. You've got an ICT coordinator, a literacy coordinator, got a teacher tutor, a timetabler, and an assessment coordinator. Now, this is just an example of a management structure. A lot of them would look very different depending on the size of the school. But this is very important if you then look at, for example, for if somebody is a head of department and let's say is on a TA3 and wants to now take on assessment coordinator as well, which would be another TA1, that would push them up to a TA4. If there are already 2 teachers on a TA4 and there's actually no space within the management structure for another TA4, that doesn't work. So what would happen in these scenarios is that they would renegotiate potentially the areas of responsibility. That person would still stay on a TA3 but would give something up and take on assessment coordinator. Or what can also happen, and happens very often, is that the management structure and that the salary policy is reviewed, because if there's actually a need for another TA4 and a teacher on that level, then that can be reviewed. So conclusion, what's something that you should take away from today's very short presentation? The salary policy should be reviewed every year, and it should be in consultation with the teachers. And quite often the rep would then phone us or consult with us with regard to the draft salary policy and the management structure, and you would then be able to feedback either individually or as departments, but also as unions represented in the particular school. You also have the right to appeal in respect of your own salary. Again, there is guidance and actually pro formas attached to the salary policy if you feel that your position on the salary policy isn't correct, or if you think that you should be awarded a teaching allowance and you're denied the right, and you can, for example, prove that your colleague has a teaching allowance and your area of responsibility is very similar or the same, then there's room to appeal that. And as I've already said, the management structure is extremely crucial to understand your promotion opportunities. I spoke to a teacher recently who hadn't had sight of the salary policy, but there was a job, there was an area of responsibility, teaching allowance, advertised internally within the school, and it was told only those on TA1 or TA2 can apply. And the teacher then came to us and said, why am I not being considered if I'm on a TA3? And again, we then had to go back to the management structure and the salary policy and explore how many teachers are there who could have a TA4, and that was then the problem there, that there wasn't actually that scope within the salary policy, within the management structure for that particular teacher to apply for that. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing here and then we can have a little question and answer session there. Right, that's me back on the screen, I think. Yep. Okay, I already see one hand up. Siobhan, hello.
Hello, how are you? I was just on that last point, Rebecca, you made, and this presentation is brilliant. I know that people without any teaching allowances can apply for the post of principal, etc., due to them being competency-based positions. So when you see a school management position going up and maybe at a tier 3 and only those who are holding a tier 1, it really rules out and is treating internal promotions very differently from external. So somebody could go out of a school and apply and become a principal and have done that, who have no TA allowance. So is there a possibility it can be reviewed or looked at or examined? Because if you're doing it, you apply for a principalship, but you can't apply for maybe a senior leadership post in a school, it becomes a bit strange.
It does. You're absolutely right, Siobhan. And the fact that we are now in a position where you can apply for a principal post without actually having a paid teaching allowance is an achievement in itself, because there was a long time where that wasn't possible, and it was really, really unfair to all those teachers who came from smaller rural schools where the budget just didn't allow for them to be awarded teaching allowances, and it just wasn't fair. They would still be doing the same work and they would still be leading on the same areas of responsibility, but their counterparts from a bigger school with a bigger budget would be able to apply for posts they weren't able to apply for. But yes, no, certainly. I suppose those internal promotions and the teaching allowances, the criteria for that is sort of set out by the Board of Governors. And if a member feels that they are not being given an opportunity, although they can provide the experience, that is certainly something we would challenge. In terms of a management structure, as I said, again, that can be challenged and it can be put to review. If it feels that it would be warranted that the management of the school reviews the salary policy, and quite often that happens. But again, I suppose where we would have to be cautious, and something that we would have to keep in mind is a school has to keep an overview of their management structure. And as I've pointed out in the beginning, you can't take teaching allowances away from people who have got them. So you could end up with loads of people on TA5, and then you have got your teaching allowances paid, and they are all sort of, I suppose, top heavy, and you don't have any more to give for people who maybe start from the bottom. So it's a very complex case, but yes, it's something that we would take on a school and an individual level, because it really does depend on the school budget and the way that the salary policy has been written and is reviewed.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's brilliant. And I just think it'd be interesting to see how many people actually have got a salary policy recently reviewed, because they're like dormant documents sitting somewhere in some closet. But I think this will bring the conversation and bring it up at branch meetings, I know, from now on. Thanks, folks. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Just to add to that, if you don't mind, Rebecca, I think one of the benefits of being aware of the salary policy is once you get into the cycle of it being reviewed, then it becomes something that people are very conscious of, and people do go back to year on year. And sometimes it takes that year on year sort of persistence to get changes that are requested. You know, it's not, I often tell people in advising them on pursuing teaching allowances or changes to the salary policy, you know, be prepared to play the long game here, because it does take a few years sometimes. And again, sometimes that's to allow for, as Rebecca's saying, the management structure to, you know, certain people might leave the school or people might retire or whatever, and it opens up opportunities. So it's certainly, once you've got it in place, once you've got a culture of reviewing the salary policy in place, it's a very, very useful tool to review salary and open up opportunities and reflect the needs of the school as well. There's a question in the chat there, Rebecca. Have you seen it?
Nope.
Okay. Well, if I read it out, do you want to?
Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah.
Teaching in a small school have a variety of coordinator roles, all unpaid. Yeah, none of the teachers have a teaching allowance and have all just been given these roles. We have not seen salary policy. Yeah. So the first thing I would advise you is to request the salary policy. And the second thing is, if you are given extra areas of responsibilities, then you would certainly need to ensure that there is time provided to fulfill these duties. And that's, of course, I should have mentioned that with all the teaching allowances that there are, you need to be able to do these within your 1 to 6 hours. Unless you are a vice principal or a principal, every task that you're being given, that you're being directed to do, including teaching allowances, have to be fulfilled within your 1 to 6 hours, and your time budget has to reflect that. So that would be the first port of call. Request the salary policy. If there are no teaching allowances in the school, and I suppose there are some schools that might not actually have any teaching allowance in the budget, it's worthwhile to review that every year, because the budget situation can change. And I know at the moment they're not necessarily changing for the better, unfortunately, but that might change in the future. Again, raise it, and you have the right and you're entitled to request the salary policy. Any other questions?
Can I just make a second point there, just off what you said there, Rebecca? Obviously request the policy. If there's no teaching allowances in your school, well then that's sorted. There are some other sort of allowances that may be pulled upon, but at the end of the day, what you're asking for is a salary assessment, and the circular is quite clear. That is meant to happen every single year. And teachers, so yourself who put that in the chat, you should receive a clear written notification regarding your salary assessment. And again, that would include the inclusion of any responsibilities. And the responsibilities assigned as part of the teaching allowances as well, just to say they reflect roles that are not required of all classroom assistants, or sorry, of all classroom teachers, and they must significantly, assist or impact on a student's educational progress as well. Because sometimes we get queries about duties that people are being asked to do under the teaching allowances as well. So again, just something to be mindful of.
Yeah, no, very good point, Danielle. Absolutely. And again, if there is a teaching allowance advertised within the school, it should come with a job description, and that job description can be reviewed as well, because elements of a job, the ICT coordinator 10 years ago was probably very different than what an ICT coordinator role is these days. And again, it has to be reflected in the time budget. So there is, personally, I don't quite understand how governors work and how a principal works without reviewing the salary policy every year. Because as you said, Kevin, if somebody retires and was in receipt of a teaching allowance, that becomes available. So in order to reallocate that or to review what's happening with the teaching allowances, they should have a look at the salary policy. I surmise that a lot of governors do review it. They might not necessarily consult with the teaching staff or share it. Quite often when we request it, or when our members request it, it's there and it might be extremely outdated, or it's there and it's just lying dormant and it hasn't been shared. But it should be. And Danielle, very interesting that you mentioned the statement of salary. I don't know whether that happens. I think certainly I haven't heard of anybody who gets a letter every year stating their salary. I don't think that's. I think the way they get around that is obviously now the portal where you can view your salary, and you obviously see it on your paycheck as well, where you're placed on this vital point. So we always advise, definitely check that you have gone up the pay scale, that there wasn't a glitch, that nothing was missed, and definitely keep your eyes and ears out for circulars that are being shared with you from your trade union, but also from the department, or best practice would be from your principal as well, in terms of your PSD process, threshold arrangements, and so on and so forth, but also teaching allowances. Oh, I think there's another question here. No.
Just one thing I would add, just as a general rule of thumb, whether it's salary policy or other things, don't be afraid to ask. So long as refusal doesn't offend. But the teachers, and we all know lots of them, can often be reluctant to go and ask for additional resource, additional pay, more so than most other professions. But when you are asking for example, an increase in the value of a teaching allowance, or simply the provision of a teaching allowance to reflect work that's going on, you're not simply going and asking for yourself for selfish reasons. You're asking, it's a position in the school that you're trying to create. It's a value that you're trying to give to a particular department or coordinator role, or to reflect an increase in the numbers in the school and increased responsibilities. But by way of example of that, I worked in a post-primary school myself for a number of years, and it was proposed by the governors that on the retirement of the heads of English, maths and science and religion, which were seen as the core subjects, that the teaching allowances would be reduced from TA2 to TA1 at the time, or the equivalent at the time. We successfully argued against that because it was demotivating to younger staff. It was devaluing the departments. It was so we had quite an enjoyable, I would say, to and fro with the governors about it, and ultimately we safeguarded those salaries for people going forward. And it wasn't particularly for any individual, because we didn't know who was going to get them, but it's in full with our school reps as well. The salary policy, and being aware of the salary policy and management structure, and the guidance that Rebecca took you through, the guidance and implementation and formulation of salary policy, or whatever it's called, it is a really useful tool for assisting your colleagues as a school rep, and for safeguarding their salaries and wages and the available career opportunities to them. So don't be afraid to use it.
It can be very interesting to read your school salary policy when you get one alongside your school development plan, because those two documents really should go hand in hand. And I think if you're in a school like yourself, S. Sweeney, who put that in the chat, if there's no teaching allowances to go around, but maybe the school development plan is incredibly ambitious, those two things may not quite meet. So I think everything is up for negotiation. The other point I would want to make is, it doesn't come up very often, but it does come up now and again, is handing back a teaching allowance. And sometimes it's just too much, or the duties have maybe expanded beyond with what you're content to do. At the last teacher's pay deal, a lot of people with the increased salary handed back the teaching allowances. So maybe Rebecca, it's worthwhile going through briefly what we would recommend for that.
Yeah, I mean, if you have obviously successfully applied and have been in receipt of a teaching allowance and have led on an area of responsibility, then we would recommend that you obviously give sufficient notice if you want to relinquish that post. And again, as with your normal resignation period, we would say 3 months. It's between you and the school leadership. If there is somebody in the school to take over quite seamlessly, then that can obviously be waived, or if you can negotiate with the principal to keep that responsibility for a little bit longer, that's fine as well. But you obviously have the right, it's a contractual entitlement to give up. You're not breaching any contract or anything by resigning from that particular post, but there is a notice period that should be given, simply to allow the school to recruit somebody to take over.
You'd mentioned earlier on as well, Rebecca, about people not, or the conditions being put on promotions and who can apply and all the rest of it. One case I came across, which was quite interesting, came across it a few times, where people were told they couldn't apply because if they got the job, they would breach the management structure. But that's, again, if you come across that in your school, that would be considered by the unions to be unfair, because it's denying you career opportunity. But just bear in mind, if you did, say, for example, you were applying for something that would take you over that threshold, you'd have a decision to make about relinquishing other roles of responsibility. But again, there shouldn't be any obstacles as far as possible put in the way of people applying for jobs. I mean, obviously, if you're going to be a head of science and you don't have a science degree, that's going to be an issue. You're not a science teacher, but realistically speaking, it was just an interesting one I came across where, once we pointed out the obvious flaw in limiting the number of people. So basically saying somebody that was maybe a literacy coordinator couldn't apply for the maths coordinator job, where they may have actually thought, you know what, I want to change here.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that, and in fact, it's good for your career progression to try different things. It's good, and just never mind career progression. It's just good for your life, for your well-being, and all the rest of it, to be able to vary your career and have some control over that. So again, where there's limitations in place on applications and things, there's probably something going on there that shouldn't be, and it's always worth asking the question, contacting your area reps or your union offices for a bit of advice and a discussion on that, because I have to say, salary policy is one thing I think we all kind of it's kind of 101 for unions when it comes down to pay and conditions. That's our kind of thing. So don't be afraid to ask us if you have any questions on it.
Yeah. Yes, Kevin, good point. And same goes with, you have to be a full-time member of staff to apply for, I don't know, a position. There have been legal challenges and tribunal cases lodged because of that, especially if that's sex discrimination, for example, because a lot of female members of staff would be on part-time contracts or flexible working. So it isn't as simple as that. The governors or the school can't just say you have to be working 5 days a week to fulfill a role.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it's still a live issue.
Oh yeah,
still happens. I shall say no more.
Yes, and going back to what I said about the teaching allowances, if somebody applies for flexible working or reduces their hours, there are responsibilities, literacy coordinator, numeracy coordinator, all of these that can potentially be done within 3 or 4 days of the week. You do the entirety of the job. If there is something, if you get a responsibility for child protection, for example, that might be more difficult because you would have to be on the premises. So it's always good to consider that upon your request and then enter those negotiations with your principal. But it shouldn't just be halved or divvied up by default. That shouldn't just happen, and it does happen all too often.
And you should be advised, and it should be in writing before and make sure you get it in writing, because it's much easier then for us to assist in people challenging those things, or when it's in writing, doesn't tend to get challenged. So because people have agreed to it, and they're going into a contract with their eyes wide open. So yeah, good point, Rebecca. Thank you.
I can't see any other questions or hands up. Well, I hope this was an informative session, and if nothing else, you now have the item salary policy on your radar. And if you are not in receipt of one, and if you haven't seen your salary policy, we would encourage you to ask for it, to request it. And if there are any questions with regard to the salary policy or any challenges, contact your school rep, your area rep, or ourselves in the office, and we'd be more than happy to assist you with whatever you need help with. Okay, so we have recorded this meeting, and we will circulate the PowerPoint afterwards as well to everyone who attended the meeting, and the recording can then be found through the individual union's website, but also on the YouTube channel. Okay, hope you all have a lovely afternoon, and thank you for attending the webinar.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.